Kevin Haggerty here with David Frame. David, I'd like to talk to you about Chapter 1 in your book, Framing Decisions. You talk about an evolving decision-making paradigm and the need for a paradigm shift. But before we talk about the shift, what's the existing paradigm? Could you tell us about that first, please?
Okay. In answering that, first it's helpful to know that a lot of the mainstream thinking in the decision science area, and that also it's migrated to other areas of decision making beyond decision science, but some of the basic principles of that we have here in the decision making canon arose from our experiences during World War II. Okay, during World War II, you had very smart people, mathematicians, psychologists, people dealing with production and operations, getting together and trying to identify better ways of manufacturing fighter aircrafts, warships, munitions, okay, and basically focusing on the possibility of quantitative solution to the complex problems they were facing in production. And this wasn't just happening in America. The British were going through this, the Germans were going through this, the Japanese were basically independently developing their own quantitative approaches to help make better decisions, optimal decisions to help in the war effort. So one thing you have to recognize when you talk about the old paradigm is that the old paradigm is rooted in these engineering type of problems that faced the various combatants during World War II. Now, over the years, that the focus on quantitative solutions to problems, not just quantitative solutions, but within the quantitative, optimal solutions, okay, to problems determined quantitatively, this focus has stuck with us, and it's stuck with us largely to this very day. Okay, and that constitutes a core element of the existing paradigm. Okay, now if you think about it, to do quantitative problem solving, this assumes that the problems you have can be clearly defined to make them amenable to quantitative analysis. So one of the precepts then, another precept of the existing paradigm is that we should be taking our problems and defining them in such a way that they are amenable to quantitative analysis, and that we can do that. Okay, another precept that flows from this is that these problems actually have solutions. Okay, I have to say, in all the books I've read in decision making and all the readings I've done in articles and papers, I've heard very little about people saying, most of the problems we deal with, okay, regarding decisions of consequence, don't have clear-cut solutions. They don't have clear-cut solutions, yet the traditional paradigm says what you got to do in decision making is formulate the problem, okay, in a very clear fashion, okay, and then quantify things, and then identify the solution, and in fact identify an optimal solution, the best solution based on your analysis. Okay, so those are the basic precepts of the existing paradigm. One final thing, there's all this emphasis on being logical, which again, who could argue with being logical, except for the fact that the real world often doesn't work that way. That's the only problem with emphasizing let's be logical. Okay, but just another example, no one would dispute that the intelligent, logical way of making a decision is, okay, first identifying a problem, then collecting data, okay, not only collecting data, investigating the problem, and part of that process of investigation yields the collection of data. Using that data, putting it into some kind of model, okay, and through analysis, coming up with a solution to the problem. Okay, once we have a solution to the problem, then implement that problem. So it's a very clear-cut, step-by-step process for doing decision-making, and on the surface, that seems great. I mean, who could argue against it? My argument against it is that in the real world, at least the world that I live in, the world that I practice my decision-making in, that's very seldom the way things actually work out. Very often you start with a hunch of what the solution is, and then you kind of backfill in your investigation to see whether you can support that hunch. And sometimes you have the solution driving the discovery effort and so on. Okay, I don't want to get into details here, but my point is that clear logical process that seems so self-evident in practice doesn't appear in quite the clean, clear-cut fashion that the decision-making textbooks tell us it appears.
So when we approach decision making following the premises of the traditional paradigm, we're searching for maybe a single best solution. What are some of the factors that traditionally have been overlooked that you believe should be studied and taken into account to improve decision making?
Okay, so I described the existing paradigm. So what you're basically asking me now is, well, what's the new paradigm? Okay, what is it that we can do that's better and leads to better decision making than what exists in the existing paradigm? Okay, I think there are lots of things we can do, and I've written a whole book on it. So I'll keep it brief and make the discussion quite high level at this point. Okay, one thing that we need to do that's just isn't treated in the traditional canon of decision making, and that is to recognize that decision making is a social activity. Okay, it's a social activity. It's made by people. They could be working in groups. These groups don't mean that they're working together. You can have groups working against each other. Okay, you have multiple sets of stakeholders. Okay, so one of the things we need to do if we're going to be effective in decision making in today's world, where we have the crises like we had back in 2008, which wasn't caused by mathematical failures, it was caused by people failures, okay, is to recognize that people lie at the heart of decision making. It's a social activity. Okay, so this has to be standing at the center of any new paradigm or any new perspective on decision making. Okay, another thing we've got to recognize is that decision making is typically the end product of wrestling with constraints. Okay, whenever you make a decision, you're facing all sorts of constraints. Traditional decision-making canon has focused on one obvious constraint that's important, and that's that we have limited information. So in traditional decision-making, we talk about decision-making with uncertainty, which means that we have limited information. We don't have enough information to make perfect decisions. So even traditional decision-making focuses on that constraint, and that's an important constraint in the new paradigm as well. Okay, but we have constraints of time. Anytime you make a decision, you've got some kind of a end date that you've got to make the decision to. You may have to make a decision immediately, on the spot. You may be given a week or two. You may be given a month. The point is that you have the constraint of time. You don't have infinite time in which to make your decision. Okay, we have constraints of resources. Okay, constrained number of people, constrained money, and yeah, traditional decision making also looks at the constraints of resources. We have constraints of political forces. Okay, sometimes there are various decisions that would be optimal under a traditional approach, leading to optimal solutions, but they're politically unacceptable. Okay, so that's a constraint we need to be aware of. What is politically acceptable and unacceptable? Okay, moving like a bull in a china shop with an optimal decision that isn't politically acceptable is asking for trouble. Okay, we have basically constraints of ethics. Now, increasingly, I want to say there in decision-making books there has been some treatment in some of the books about issues of ethics, and these are important. A big part of my argument is that we need to take into account the moral dimension of decision-making, and certainly phrasing it that way, looking at the moral dimension, isn't something that's very big in traditional decision-making fare. So we have constraints of personalities, we have constraints of human laws and these kinds of things. So we operate with constraints, and then I've already mentioned under the new paradigm there's a major de-emphasis on the central role of rationality in decision-making. And again, I'm not going to go into that here because that alone, that argument on the misplaced emphasis on trying to achieve rationality probably occupies 20% of what the book is focused on. So I'll cover those in future discussions.
Okay, so I begin to understand what the subtitle of the book, Decision Making That Accounts for Irrationality, People, and Constraints, involves when you talk about this new paradigm. It sounds like what you'd like to see is decision-making science taken out from under the microscope or the laboratory and get a reality check and take into account all these factors that are out of the control of a limited quantitative analysis, maybe.
Well, I think a large part of one of my sort of side interests, and something I've actually been involved with myself, is small entrepreneurial business development. And I set up the technology entrepreneurship program at GW a long time ago, and I've had tremendous interest in that area, and I myself have been involved with a number of entrepreneurial ventures. And it's funny because coming at this from the point of view of an entrepreneur as a decision maker, people are the key issue that they're focusing on. Okay, when venture capitalists go in a company to see the business plan, the first section they look at the business plan are who are the key players. Okay, the most important aspect of a venture capital company going in and looking at a business isn't the balance sheet. Okay, it's who are the players and interviewing them and seeing whether they have the energy, the insights, the point of view, the ethics, and so forth to be good. So yeah, I mean, I find it so strange at this point. Okay, now that I've actually spent the last couple of years looking at a different approach to decision making, I find it so strange that for years I've been teaching decision making according to standard canon and haven't been talking about some of these obvious things like some of the irrationalities and the people factors and some of the moral issues that any entrepreneur is going to put at the top of their list.
Well, thank you, David, for sharing your thoughts on the paradigm shift, or hopefully the paradigm shift that we'll see in time to come.
Welcome.